Last week we got a taste of this little sermon with the blessings and the woes, and the teaching continues today. But I say to you that listen, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who abuse you. If anyone strikes you on the cheek, offer the other also. And from anyone who takes away your coat, do not even withhold your shirt. Give to everyone who begs from you, and if anyone takes away your goods, do not ask for them again. Do to others as you would have them do to you. If you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners love those who love them. If you do good to those who do good to you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners do that. If you lend to those from whom you have to receive, what credit is that to you? For even sinners lend to sinners to receive as much again. But love your enemies, do good, and lend, expecting nothing in return. Your reward will be great, and you will be children of the Most High. For he is kind to the ungrateful and wicked, but merciful, just as your Father is merciful. And do not judge, and you will not be judged. Do not condemn, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Give, and it will be given to you a good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over, will be put into your lap. For the measure you give will be the measure you get back. Thanks be to God for this word to us. Once upon a time, a minister was preaching on this passage about enemies, and at one point he said, how many of you feel like you have enemies in your lives? Raise your hands if you have a lot of enemies. A few people raised their hands. So he lowered the bar. How many of you feel like you have a few enemies? Some more hands went up. How many of you feel like you only have one or two enemies? Just raise your hands. And by this time, almost every hand in the place was up. He said, okay, now, everybody put their hands down. We're going to switch this around. How many of you think you have no enemies at all? One hand went up. And the minister said, oh, that's exciting. That is absolutely amazing. Tell us about that. This old guy in the back stands up and he says, well, I'm 98 years old. And I'm happy to say I have no enemies whatsoever. And the minister goes, oh, that's absolutely a blessing. How on earth did you do that? What a wonderful Christian life you must have led. And the guy said, well, honestly, it's just that I'm 98 years old, and all those blankety blanks have died. I guess that's one way to get rid of your enemies. This morning we're kind of in rough territory. In this section, Jesus is talking about how we deal with our difficult people. The people who have hurt us, the people who have abused us, rejected us, and maybe even just those people that kind of just bug us. And to put it simply, what he says is very, very challenging. Last week we ran headlong into Luke's versions of the Beatitudes, which are Beatitudes and woes. And this is, of course, as I said, what we call the Sermon on the Plain. Now, this sermon parallels a much longer sermon that we find in Matthew. That's called the Sermon on the Mount because in Matthew he's pictured sitting on the side of a hill teaching to the crowd below him. But in Luke, he's at the foot of the hill. And so it's called the Sermon on the Plain. But probably maybe the same sermon. But in Luke, the teachings are shorter and they're a little bit different. So last week we ran into the Beatitudes, and let's face it, the Beatitudes are crazy. They take what we think about good and evil and basically turn it upside down. The whole list is essentially counterintuitive, right? Blessings are what we normally think of as woes. The woes are basically what we always think of as blessings. And by the end of the Beatitudes, we're kind of already shaken out of our complacency and our comfort zone, which is good. That's good, because it helps us understand just how much we need sacred presence, how much we need the Spirit. to help us through each day. But then we get these teachings from today. Love your enemies. Turn the other cheek. Give until it hurts. Give to the people that don't deserve it. Some people wonder if Jesus really meant that stuff. I think he did. But it is complicated. And maybe it's a little bit more deep than we think. So let's take a look at a couple of these things. If somebody slaps you on the cheek, and actually in the Greek, and particularly in the Greek in the Matthew version, it's actually, if somebody slaps you on the right cheek, so it's specifically the right cheek. Somebody slaps you on the right cheek, offer that person the left cheek as well. Now, some read this statement and think Jesus is simply saying, okay, somebody assaults you, just take it. Right? Just take it. Don't respond. Be non-resistant. Be passive. Be compliant. But that may not be what Jesus had in mind completely. Maybe Jesus is not offering us two choices, violence or passivity, hitting back or simply taking it and allowing the other person to dominate or maybe even abuse us. According to numerous scholars, including Walter Wink, in Jesus' time and culture, it was forbidden to strike anyone with your left hand. The left hand was unclean. I apologize to those of you who are left-handed if there's anybody in the room, but in the Bible, actually, left-handers were considered unclean. So you couldn't strike anybody with your left hand. Well, now if you think about it, how do you hit somebody on the right cheek with the right hand? You do it this way. It's a backhand. It's a backhand slap. And that backhand slap in Jesus' time was basically an intended insult. It was a normal way for somebody who had power and control to reprimand somebody who was underneath them, who was less than them, like a master reprimanding a servant. So in the scenario Jesus is setting up is one where an oppressor, somebody wealthy and powerful, slaps as a reprimand or insult a person who is less than them. So how does that person respond? Well, one way to respond is just take it, right? You kind of cower a little bit, you submit, you slink away. That's one way to do it. Or you can strike back, right? You can fight. Or, and this is what Jesus offers here, you can defiantly turn your other cheek and challenge them to hit you again. Forcing them, however, by turning the left cheek, them to use the left hand, which was not an option. So basically the person is saying, you've got to hit me with your right hand if you're going to hit me again. But to hit me with your right hand and hit my left cheek, you're going to have to use your open hand, or you're going to have to use your fist. And that is the way you would hit a peer. That is the way you would hit an equal, not a person who's less than. So it's not as simple and literal as don't return violence with violence. It's that, but it's more, right? It is the oppressed person in effect saying, you can't treat me like nothing. I'm a person, you have to take me seriously, and if you're going to hit me, use your fist and treat me as an equal. I'm going to force you to treat me as an equal, which transforms the encounter from both sides. The oppressor is being forced to look at the person in front of them in a new way, and the person who's being oppressed is standing up for themselves, but also is doing it in a way that does not escalate the encounter. So rather than ignoring an evil situation, the inequity and abuse of power, which is illustrated by hitting the other person, and hoping it will simply go away, Jesus is telling his followers to find a creative and active and nonviolent way to assert their humanity and assert God's love in the world. Let's look at the second admonition, right? If somebody asks you for your coat, give that person your shirt as well. Now, in Jesus' time, basically, people had an inner shirt, an inner kind of like a small, light robe that they would wear underneath, and then a heavier outer robe, the coat. It had two layers. So this one, somebody asks you for your coat, outer layer. Give them your shirt, inner layer, as well. Think underwear here. Okay? Think underwear here. That's what we're talking about, right? He says, if somebody asks you for your outer garment, give the person the inner garment. Well, what's left? Nothing. Right? You got a guy standing stark naked in the middle of the street. Now here's the significance of that. What we know is that nakedness was considered to be taboo in Judaism. But the interesting thing about it is that when somebody saw somebody naked, the person that was shamed was not the person who was naked, but the person who saw them. I know, that's a little weird, but that's the way it was. If you want a reference for that, you can think about Noah. We all know Noah, right? But there's a story in the story of Noah where Noah's son sees him naked. Noah apparently got drunk and passed out naked. Sees him naked, but the shame does not fall on Noah. The shame falls on Noah's son. So again, what we have is a very interesting little thing here, right? The aggressor is left standing with the person's coat in one hand and then basically their underwear in the other hand. The debtor is standing in front of them naked, but it's the aggressor who is shamed. Tables are turned. Again, by going above and beyond the man who responds to the horrible request that he give his one coat, which would leave him without basic clothing. Most Palestinians only had one coat. By responding to that, by also handing over the inner garment, that person drove home the injustice and inequity in the request, challenged the system. Now, we know a bit about those kinds of systems, right? We live in a country where inequity is growing, where 70% of the world has more economic equity than America does. We live in a country where wealth is flowing heavily toward the rich and away from the poor at this point in history. So we have some unique responses here in this passage from Jesus about how to deal with aggression and brutality on the one hand, and injustice on the other hand. Responses that, on the one hand, do confront the aggression and the injustice. So you don't just sit back and let it happen, but do it without multiplying the violence and without multiplying the hate. So the first thing to notice is Jesus actually advocates resistance. We are to challenge aggressive brutality. We are to challenge injustice. We are to challenge inequity. Now, we already know that because of the way Jesus started his ministry. Everybody remember the passage he uses when he starts his ministry? He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners, recovery of sight for the blind, and to set the oppressed free. So we already know that's what Jesus is all about. So the first thing we notice is that he advocates resistance to that which is not right. But the second thing to notice is that these are responses that do not turn the followers into the very kind of people they're resisting, which is such a temptation, right? Such a temptation. These responses do not answer violence with violence, do not answer hate with hate, do not answer abuse with abuse, thus continuing the problem, escalating the problem, creating increased enmity and increased violence. And we don't have to look very far to know exactly how that works, right? When violence is responded to with violence and hate is responded to with hate. This is the strategy Paul talks about later when he writes, do not overcome evil with evil, but overcome evil with good. Now I can hear the yeah buts in everybody's heads, right? But what about good wars? But what about violent intruders? It's complicated. I'm not going to argue that. But for the moment, let's keep this at the individual daily level. Let's think about this in terms of how we deal with those people who come our way and attack us, treat us poorly, or do something that we really just feel is unjust. What if, instead of acting in ways to escalate things, we insist upon our own humanity and our own value, we insist upon the humanity and value and dignity of other people, and resist, but do not do so in kind. That seems to be what Jesus is teaching. Don't go low. Don't go low. By the way, Jesus lived what he taught, didn't he? If you think about it, the ultimate example of these verses is the cross. God looked at hate, oppression, injustice, and violence in the eye in that whole episode on Easter and said, this all stops here. Love's going to trump evil. And so he went as a lamb, we are told in the scriptures, to the cross. Love is going to trump evil. Sure, he was killed, but that wasn't the end of the story, was it? Because death lost and was transformed by what happened on that day. So what is interesting to me is that Jesus talks about resistance and talks about non-escalation. But what's really interesting is he goes one more step further. He doesn't stop talking about after he talks about how we respond to oppression, he keeps going. Not only are we to break the chain of hate and violence, not only are we to stop and end escalation of hate and violence, not only are we to engage in a unique kind of defense, but we're to go on the offensive by not treating people the way they deserve, by not treating them fairly, but going beyond into the realm of unconditional love. Do unto others as you would have them to do you, as you would have them do to you. Now we know this, right? This is the golden rule. But this is merely the rule of reciprocity. You treat a person the way you want to be treated. And Jesus goes, that's no big deal. That's not all that great, folks. What I'm asking you to do, Jesus says, is go beyond that. Don't just behave generously because you expect that they'll treat you generously. Everybody does that. That's the way of the world. In fact, it's so much a way of the world that even people that are absolute jerks do that. People who don't care about God do that. People who aren't spiritual do that. People who aren't righteous do that, right? It's just practical. If you love those who love you, what credit is that? Even sinners love those who love you. If you do good to those who do good to you, what credit is that? Even sinners do that. If you lend to those from whom you hope to receive, what credit is that? Even sinners lend to sinners and receive much again. The reality is, Jesus is pushing us way past the golden rule. We are just buying into reciprocity when we sit on the golden rule, which is simply the old way. Jesus pushes us into more. Love unmerited, love unearned. Love your enemies. Do good, lend, expect nothing in return. Your reward will be great, and you will be children of the Most High. For that's how God functions. Right? He is kind to the ungrateful and to the wicked. Be merciful then, just as your Father is merciful. Now this is tough stuff, right? It rebels against everything we think and know. But as the Beatitude, we are not let off the hook. We are to act in such a way that it changes the game. There's a wonderful story that comes in Corrie ten Boom's book, The Hiding Place. Corrie ten Boom was a young woman in Germany, and she and her sister Betsy were interned in a Nazi concentration camp. They were not Jewish. They were Christian, but they had helped the Jewish people. And years later, at a Christian rally in Munich, and she'd given her witness of faith, up to her at the end of the talk comes up an SS officer who had been one of the SS officers who had watched over the women in the camp in which she had been interned. And he walked up to her and he said, I'm very grateful for your message, Fräulein. To think, as you said, Christ has washed away my sins. And she said she stood there paralyzed looking at this guy's hand, right? Because this is one of the people who had killed her sister and had abused her. And she finally prayed and she says, she said, Jesus, I can't forgive him. Give me your forgiveness. And as she whispered the words, her hand reached out and grasped him, and then she writes, the most incredible thing happened. From my shoulder along my arm through my hand, a current passed from me to him, while into my heart sprang a love for this stranger that overwhelmed me. In that moment, in the taking of that hand, something happened, right? The chain of hate broke. The two lives were transformed. Now, she could have legitimately said, forget you. You're an SS officer. You killed my sister. Forget it. She could have done that. But she didn't. And so in that moment, the chain of hate was broken, and both his life and her life were transformed. Two people, one trapped by a sense of being wronged, and one trapped by the fact that he had done so much that was wrong, were released from that, and love was born. Love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. If I were to summarize the big teachings of this passage, that's finally kind of where we have to come down with, because this will keep us thinking for months, right? This is a tough passage. If I were to summarize the big teaching of this passage, it would be this way. We are always to act in a way that leaves room for change and room for reconciliation. Christians sometimes make the mistake of thinking that the final admonition to stop judging and condemning in this passage means that the church should never make a moral judgment. That's not right. But in the context of this sermon, the saying likely means that we should never act like it's over. We should never act like it's too late for hate to be turned to love, or for greed to be turned to generosity, or for anger to be changed into forgiveness. To be unforgiven and to be unforgiven is to be in prison. To judge and be judged is to be in prison. And one of the things Jesus came to do is to set the prisoners free. We are called to be free from that prison. We are called to be people who, by how we respond, how we live, create room for love, and create room for reconciliation, and create room for change. We are to be people who allow that room and set other people and set ourselves free. Let's pray. Almighty God, we thank you for this passage. We kind of thank you for this passage. It's a little tough. But thank you for this passage, for challenging us in these times when enmity is so prevalent. Hate is so prevalent, when everybody is acting in a way that causes the divisions among us to escalate and get wider. Thank you for this passage, which reminds us that we are to live in a way that creates room for reconciliation, room for love, room for change, room for forgiveness. Help us to be those kinds of people. This we pray. Amen.